Hello everyone. This is 13th week. We will discuss Philippians. The letter written by Paul to the church in Philippi. So Philippians written around 54 to 55, almost like 2 years earlier, like 2 years later than First Corinthians. And Philippians is called the letter of joy. Letter of joy. Usually, in his letters, Paul deals with many difficult issues in his churches. So he's sometimes angry, other times upset, other times, he's very urgent. So in the beginning of the letters, Paul betrays his own emotions. But this is very exceptional because Paul doesn't present his own anger, or Paul is not anxious about anything about the church in Philippi. Instead, he shows how happy and joyful whenever he thinks of the church in Philippi. So this is called the letter of joy, very unusual letter written by Paul. But in contrast to the mood found in the letter to the Philippians, Paul's visit to the city Philippi, the first visit to Philippi, was not that fun. He was ill-treated by Philippians, so he didn't spend much time there. So the city of Philippi was in the eastern Macedonia, northeast of Thessaloniki, along one of the major trade routes through the region. And this is the first city in Europe that Paul visited. Paul speaks in 1 Thessalonians of being shamefully treated in Philippi prior to his taking mission to Thessaloniki, 1 Thessalonians 2:2. So this was Greece, and probably Philippi is around here, and Thessaloniki here, and Athens and Corinth. So Paul first visited Philippi, and he was ill-treated. He moved to Thessaloniki, and then Athens, and then Corinth. So this is the route that Paul took in his second missionary journey. In view of their rough treatment, Paul and his companions may not have spent much time there, perhaps only enough to make some converts, instruct them in the rudiments of the faith, and get out of town while the getting was good. Paul wrote to the Philippian church from a jail in Ephesus, winter of 54 to 55, according to chapter 1, verse 7. Paul explains to the Philippian church, how his imprisonment in Ephesus turned out to be a very miraculous success of his mission. In Ephesus, what happened was, Paul was in prison. So probably this was in Praetoria, the governor's palace, and there was prison. And in one of the cells, Paul was there, and every probably 3 to 4 hours, the guards were, circulating. The guards were changed. And whenever a guard was there, Paul was engaged in conversation with him, and somehow, miraculously, Paul was able to convert the guards. So pretty soon, most of the guards there became converts, and they knew that Paul was not there because of some sort of a crime, and because of Paul's imprisonment, most of the guards got converted, and people knew that people came to know Jesus Christ and God through Paul's effort. So Paul tells Philippians in chapter 1, 7 to 11. Paul says that he was pretty happy that his imprisonment turned out to be a great opportunity for proclaiming the gospel to the guards in the governor's, Pretoria, the palace. So from the time of its founding, the Philippian church had a turbulent history. The church was hounded by opponents from outside. Philippians 1:28-30. Why don't we take a look at the situation? Okay. So Philippians 1:7, Paul says, "It's right for me to think this way about all of you because you hold me in your heart, for all of you sharing God's grace with me, both in my imprisonment and in the defense and confirmation of the gospel." So Paul's imprisonment was the result of his defense of the gospel, and this tells us about Paul's situation. 27, let's see. Here, okay? Here Paul says, "Live your life in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or I am absent and hear about you, I'll know that you are standing firm in one spirit, striving side by side with one mind for the faith of the gospel, and are in no way intimidated by your opponents." So there are opponents from outside who try to persecute the church in Philippi. For them, this is evidence of their destruction, but of your salvation, and it's God's doing. So Paul says, you have to stand with one mind for the faith of the gospel. So some sort of attacking from outside was happening in the Philippian church. Who afflicted persecution and opponents from outside on the church, maybe local Jews or who knows, and fractured by the pettiness and jealousy of insiders. So opponents from outside, and also insiders' problem. There was one issue, insider issue, 4:2-3. Here, okay, here. Paul says, "Therefore, my brothers and sisters, whom I love and long for, my joy and crown, stand firm in the Lord." Again, stand firm in the Lord. "I urge Euodia and I urge Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord." So these are ladies, two ladies. Paul asks them to be of the same mind in the Lord. That means that, they were "Yes, and I ask you also, my loyal companion, help these women, for they have struggled beside me in the work of the gospel, together with Clement and the rest of my co-workers whose names are in the book of life." So Euodia and Syntyche were co-workers of Paul in the church in Philippi, but somehow these two ladies, church leaders, became fighting against one another, and Paul want them to be of the same mind. This is a very usual type of issue that occurs in the church. So two church leaders, insiders, they were competing against each other because of jealousy and things like that. So outsiders, Judaizers, outside opponents, and pettiness and jealousy of insiders, and Euodia, Syntyche. So two issues. Some there preached the gospel out of love and respect for Paul, others preached it out of partisanship. So obviously, some even in Ephesus, what happened was, while Paul was in prison cell in Ephesus, some people preached the gospel, thinking that since Paul cannot proclaim the gospel to people in Ephesus, they have to take Paul's role in proclaiming the gospel. So they, out of love and respect, they proclaim, but others preached it out of partisanship. In other words, they want to make Paul feel sad by proclaiming the gospel. What is going on in their minds? That's that, by showing up the way they can proclaim the gospel to the Gentiles, they can make Paul feel miserable since, Paul is in prison. So, Paul even has, his own opponents in Ephesus. So in the church, you may have opponents from outside and internal divisions. We all are human beings and we are suffering from our humanness. Unfortunately, Philippian church and Paul had a similar issue. But Paul says, don't fight, but over the same mind, or one mind. And you have to be in unity. So that's the Paul's major advice. It's not easy to come to a unity, come to have the same mind or one mind. It's not easy, but that's what Paul recommends. So now, relationship between Paul and the Philippians. But throughout these strange and stresses, the relationship between Paul and the Philippian church remained warm and deeply affectionate. This was very usual. Usually, Paul's churches were challenging Paul's own apostleship and the contents of Paul's gospel, but somehow the relationship between Paul and Philippian church was very warm and affectionate. This was very unusual. The Philippians gave financial support to Paul's mission in Thessaloniki and possibly also in Corinth. So Philippi, Thessaloniki, and then Athens, and then Corinth. So Paul moved around. But the church in Philippi, they supported Paul in his mission trip in Thessaloniki and in Corinth. So we have that information. Let's see. 1 Thessalonians 4:16 and 2 Corinthians 11:9. Let's see what we have. 1 Thessalonians. Where is 1 Thessalonians? 4:16. Here we go. For the Lord himself, with a cry of command, this is the letter sent to the Philippians, with the archangel's call and with the sound of God's trumpet will descend from heaven, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Oh, this is not. Oh, actually, Philippians 4:16. Sorry about that. Philippians 4:16. Paul says, for even when I was in Thessalonica, you sent me help for my needs more than once. So obviously we can tell that, Paul, I mean the church in Philippi, the Philippian churches, helped Paul in his missionary activity in Thessalonica more than once. So Paul is very thankful about that. How about 2 Corinthians 11:9? 11:9, Paul says, when I was with you and was in need, I did not burden anyone, for my needs were supplied by the friends who came from Macedonia. So while writing a letter to the Corinthian church, Paul confesses that his needs were supplied by the friends from Macedonia. So I refrain and will continue to refrain from burdening you in any way. So who are those friends from Macedonia? Probably the Philippian church, the church members from the church in Philippi. So they gave generously to the Jerusalem collection, 2 Corinthians 8, 1-5. Let's see what we have. 2 Corinthians 8, 1-5. We want you to know, brothers and sisters, about the grace of God that has been granted to the churches of Macedonia. Oh yeah, here we have churches of Macedonia. For during a severe ordeal of affliction, their abundant joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. So Macedonian church donated a lot of money and finances in Paul's Paul in during his missionary activity, and that's what Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Paul says, "For as I can testify, they voluntarily gave according to their means, and even beyond their means, begging us earnestly to the privilege of sharing in this ministry of the saints, and this not merely as we expected. They gave themselves first to the Lord, and by the will of God to us." So they gave to the Lord and to us. So first church members, the church members in the Philippian church donated money to Paul so that Paul may continue his missionary activity and help the poor in Jerusalem. Okay, those poor Jewish Christians in Jerusalem, because at that time there was a huge famine in Jerusalem, and Paul wanted to help them. And they sent Epaphroditus to care for Paul in prison. Philippians 2:25. Epaphroditus. So while Paul was in prison in Ephesus, in ancient time, if you are in prison, you need the government or the prison, those who are in charge of prison didn't offer you food or service or water to those who are in prison. So if you are in prison, then you need somebody who can take care of you in terms of feeding. So the Philippian church sent one of their members called Epaphroditus so that he may take care of Paul. And fortunately, but what happened to Epaphroditus was that while he was caring for Paul, he got sick, and the Philippian church became a little bit worried about Epaphroditus and his welfare. So Paul prayed for him, and obviously and miraculously Epaphroditus become well. So Paul wanted to send him back to the Philippian church so that the church members there in Philippi may be comforted by God's grace shown to Epaphroditus. So that's what we find in Philippians 2:25. Paul was returned to Philippi on his way to Corinth. Paul wanted to visit Philippi anytime soon, and possibly on his final visit to Jerusalem with the offering. And when in prison, Paul writes movingly of his love and longing for the Philippian believers, especially to comfort them with the news that Epaphroditus is now well and longing to go back to them. So Philippians 2:25. Let's open Philippians 2:25. Yeah. Still, I think it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother and co-worker and fellow soldier, your messenger, and minister to my need. So obviously, Epaphroditus was sent by the Philippian church to minister to Paul, and he has been ill and now well, so he has been longing for all of you and has been distressed because you heard that he was ill. He was indeed so ill that he nearly died, but God had mercy on him, and not only on him, but on me also, so that I would not have one sorrow after another. So I am the more eager to send him back, so that you may rejoice at seeing him again, and that I may be less anxious. So Paul wanted to send Epaphroditus back, so that he may comfort those Philippian church members who are in sorrow after having heard about the sickness of Epaphroditus. Okay, where are we? Okay, Paul's imprisonment. So what's going on in terms of Paul's imprisonment? What's going on? What happened? What happened to Paul? What happened to Paul? When Paul wrote the letter from prison, one judicial hearing had already been held, and either Paul's condemnation or his release seemed imminent. So in Ephesus, while Paul was in prison, he had one judicial hearing, and there comes a judgmental conclusion. There comes a conclusion at the judicial conclusion, and Paul could either be condemned and he'll be killed, or they will say, he's free and he will be released. Paul, however, is not worried about his own life, because if he's released, then he will work for the church community. But if he is condemned, then he says he will go to the Lord and then take a rest eternally. Personally, this is a personal choice. He want to be with the Lord personally. However, he knows that his life will be more useful to the church, and this is more church. This is a church's choice. His mission continued, however, in spite of the change. Some, both inside and outside the Praetorian Guard, were touched by Paul's own witness. Some of the slaves and freedmen from Caesar's household were converted. Through the courageous example of the apostles, some believers who were timid had become fearless. Word of Paul's imprisonment eventually leaked out to the congregation in Philippi, and they sent Epaphroditus to take care of him. Paul, however, claims that for the sake of his continued missionary activity, he would be released. Did he get inspiration from the Spirit about his release? But somehow, he was convinced that he should be released so that he may continue his missionary activity, because, that's what God wanted Paul to do. Paul wanted to have a personal rest in the kingdom of the Lord, but that's not what God wanted at this moment. So probably he was released and continued his missionary activity. He uses the letter to comment on his adversity and to reassure his congregation that it has turned out for the good. It has turned out for the good. As a result of his bonds, others have become emboldened to preach. Paul uses his own situation to explain that suffering is the destiny of Christians in the present evil age. Also, hearing the internal conflicts, Paul encourages the Philippians to be unified, serving one another rather than themselves, and thereby following the example of Christ. So two major messages that Paul want to make here. Number one, suffering. Just as Paul had to go through suffering while he was proclaiming the gospel of Jesus to the people, suffering is one aspect of the destiny of Christians in the present evil age. So Paul says then, you people in Philippi, you may be persecuted by outsiders, but that suffering is a part of your destiny. So accept it as a necessary part of your being Christian. That's one message. Number two, unified, or unity, or of the same mind. Obviously, in order for you to stand firm against the outsiders, you should maintain the unity inside your community. However, as I mentioned before, Euodia and Syntyche are fighting against each other, and according to these two female leaders, church congregation was divided. So Paul's advice is that you have to be unified, serving one another. And how can you serve one another? You need humbleness. You have to humble yourself, thinking that that person or other person is better than you. When you think that I am better than others, then there comes a fight. But when you think that when you humble yourself, lowering yourself and hiring others, and then the fight usually comes over. But Paul has to give a good example of humbleness, and that is found in the example of Christ in chapter 2 of Philippians 1-11. And this passage contains kenosis hymn. Kenosis hymn. Kenosis in Greek means emptiness. So this early hymn written around early mid 30s to early 40s reflects Antioch Hellenist theology. And in this hymn, they are singing about Christ's own humbleness, which should be modeled by all the other disciples of Jesus. And that's what Paul explains in this hymn, Kenosis hymn. We will discuss that in a minute, okay? So what time is it? Oh, 25. So why don't we take a quick break and we will resume our lecture here, Opponents at Philippi. All right? Thank you very much.